Hello and welcome to today's web seminar, Driver Retention, a Realistic Assessment of the Issue. This web seminar is brought to you by Cline University. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly talk about the technology we'll be using today. All of your lines have been muted for the duration of the web seminar. However, you can enter any inquiries or questions via the chat box or question box at any time, and we'll queue them up for the conclusion of the presentation. You can also slide the GoToWebinar window by clicking the orange arrow or double black arrow, but do not click the black X or you will exit the web seminar. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Today's special guest speaker and subject matter expert is Dave DeBolt. He's a transportation safety consultant, was previously the VP of Risk Services for Cline Wood and a safety director for a large motor carrier. Dave's also involved with industry associations like the ATA, the National Tank Carriers Association, and the Kansas and Missouri Motor Carrier Associations. With that, Dave, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome you to this webinar, and thank you very much for your attendance. The purpose of this webinar is to address an issue that is very, very dear to me as I have pursued my career in safety and particularly in the recruiting and retention process. There are several impact factors that affect your individual retention, and they are how you recruit, how successful you are in recruiting, what is your driver turnover, what is your cost of hiring, and that's a subject that we will discuss at length, your acceptance of the current condition or the status quo. In other words, are you willing to accept and continue to recruit and not retain like you are now, if that is what's going on. Part of this will evolve into your company culture. What is the culture that your company has, exists, and displays in retaining drivers? And then finally, your willingness to explore change as a owner, as a manager, as a CEO. You are called upon to address many, many subjects, and this is just one of them. First of all, we cannot address retention until we just lightly touch on the recruiting aspect. And that recruiting aspect is how the numbers are beginning to fall. Originally, when I was extremely active, the recruiting, the turnover numbers were somewhere around 130%. Projected in 2015, those, my guess is, I'm saying somewhere around 100%. The national average is coming down, and currently, according to the American Trucking Association, is somewhere in the vicinity of 90%. So that simply means that if you are an average company, and I hate to use that term average because nobody's average, that you are losing 9 out of 10 drivers that you have or that you hire. And to me, that is a significant figure. What is your turnover rate? And there are several factors that influence that. What are the critical factors? And these are the items that you need to begin to identify if you're going to retain the drivers that you hire. My studies in many companies indicate that many drivers, and I do not have an exact percentage, but many drivers leave within 90 days of hire. And what we want to do and what we want to explore is breaking that particular cycle. It is imperative for retention to break that cycle and break it decisively. This was an eye-opener to me when I originally got into this. When I was still with a motor carrier, I received a form that was a computation form for your cost of hiring, for my cost of hiring. So I sit down with the rest of my management staff, or I gave it to each department head and requested of them that they write down what their contributing costs to hiring a driver were. Maintenance, sales, administration, operations, all of those factors have a cost associated with them. And when we summed up the total amount in 1994, which is a long time ago, our cost of hiring was somewhere around $6,250 for each driver. And that was we computed that cost from the initial phone call or contact with an incoming driver to the day that driver produced his first revenue generating load. And I believe that that is an honest and fair evaluation. There are both direct and indirect costs associated with hiring a driver. The direct costs are quite easy to compute, and that is when you begin to factor in the cost of your advertising, the cost of travel for drivers coming to and from, or your recruiters going to and from, the cost of maintaining a recruiting staff, and all the administrative costs associated with bringing a driver or onboarding a driver. Addressing retention versus the revolving door is critical to this cost of hiring process. You cannot, and I am firmly convinced, you cannot win the cost of the recruiting battle until such time you have addressed and possibly corrected your retention factor. This cost of hiring is significant. The first thing that has to happen when you begin this process as an owner, as a CEO, as a manager, is you have to step back and address the status quo. And by status quo, I simply mean, are you willing to stay the course of where your recruiting and retention is currently? If you are losing, if you're losing 9 out of 10 drivers that you hire, and your cost of hiring is $6,000, you pick the figure. You can put it at 2, you can put it at 10, you can put it at whatever you want to. We actually have the form that we could provide, if you so desire, to compute that cost of hiring. But if you're willing to accept the status quo, then I would suggest that it would be maybe not a waste of time, but it would not be a significant contributor to time if you did not change how you're hiring and your retention of addressing your retention. The nature of the beast. I've heard this said over and over and over by many managers such as yourself. When we start to talk about retaining drivers, when we start to talk about recruiting drivers, and I would make a suggestion or I would ask a question, the comment comes back, this is just the nature of the beast, Dave. This is the way it's been. This is the way it's going to go forward. And we cannot, we've tried, but it's just the nature of the beast. Drivers are a gypsy breed. Generally, it's the bottom third that churns. And what we want to do is, if you're willing to address that and get rid of and not accept the nature of the beast format, then we can move forward. If you do not do this, you're just going to continue the revolving door continually through the process of hiring and transition, training, and then the driver leaves. The costs associated with this, we've already discovered. We've already discussed. The unknown factors are service failures. Because you have drivers that are leaving or drivers that are in training or drivers that are in transition from one particular service within your company to another, and you have service failures, that leads to what we ultimately say is customer dissatisfaction. And I would ask you a very blunt question, if you don't mind. How hard is it to find a new customer? And then how hard is it to keep that customer? It is critical to me that you keep every customer that you want to keep, letting go only those that you don't want to keep. If you, I believe that we all are in the trucking business to make a profit. We want to provide good service. We want to provide a totality of service. But in the ultimate test is where is our bottom line. And service failures and customer dissatisfaction contribute, I don't need to tell you, significantly to that profit margin. In the process of addressing this, you must step back sometime and say to yourself, is this something that I really want to address? Is it possible to change the culture, and I'll go back just a moment, to the nature of the beast? Is it possible to change this culture without a great deal of upheaval within our company? The first thing that in my consulting side that we have always done is once a company, you or somebody significantly in your upper management staff has said, we need to start this process. And the process starts with a very objective assessment. And this to me involves a look at each department and how that department contributes or fails to contribute to retaining a driver. And let me just that is a department-wide factor. It just is not your operations department. It is just not your maintenance department. And sometimes it is more fortuitous, if you would, to get an outside independent review to see exactly where changes and improvements could be made. It has to address all the factors impacting drivers. And let me digress here for just a moment. When you study ATA studies or you review those, it says that pay is not the most significant factor in retaining a driver. And I would submit, just simply for argument, that if a driver is not treated fairly, if he is dispatched or his perception of the dispatch is poor, or that he is not being treated fairly, then I think that affects his pay. And let me give you an example. I leased an owner-operator to my former company, and we had a very sophisticated computer matrix that I could tell an owner-operator what he was going to make or paid to the truck based on percentage for each running mile the first week he was there through all of the rest of his career. We had an average, we had averaged that all out, and we could just, it was within a cent or two of exactly what did in fact happen. I leased a very promising owner-operator on, and he came in about 2 weeks before that, or after that, and said, Dave, I'm not making what you told me I was going to make. And I'll just use the figure. Initially, he was told he was going to make $1.05 a running mile, and this was some time ago, so the costs have gone up. And he said, I'm making 90 cents a running mile. And I said, I've used another expletive, deleted, but I went in and talked to my operations people. And we were in the height of our busy season. Of course, this was always when it would happen. And one of my dispatchers reared back in his chair and he said, David, I want to tell you that I'm not going to give my best hauls to my best customers to a driver that I don't know anything about. And he used the words, "I don't know how powerful he is." So in subsequent addressing this issue of driver retention and driver pay, that is one of the first things that I recommend in your assessment you look at. Does a new driver get paid, receive pay? Is there an equity of dispatch with a driver that has been with you for 5 years? Now, maybe there are dedicated hauls, and there are a lot of factors that enter into this, but I went back to my owner-operator and I said, we made a mistake. I made a mistake. That's been corrected. And so he subsequently got a little bit better haul, but I addressed my recruiting staff and said, be totally truthful. And we're going to revise our figures because we don't want somebody coming in and saying, you lied to me. And how many times have you had a driver who is leaving, and you know he's leaving, come in and basically tell you, you lied to me? And he may have used worse, better, or worse language than that, but it happens. Every department has to participate or be reviewed in this assessment process. I cannot emphasize that enough. Everybody participates in this process. How a driver is treated on the most mundane things, the most minor items, sometimes can cause that driver to be very much dissatisfied. And my experience has been that once a driver becomes dissatisfied, very, very hard to change his perception of what is happening, and that's the key word, perception. I know of companies, and I have worked with companies who, in this process, set a retention goal for each department. And I've listened to salespeople say, what do you mean a goal for a sales department? Well, a driver pulls in and he has a problem with a customer. The first person that customer calls is the salesman that he is his contact person. So right there is the focal point of how sales participates. And I've seen salesmen come out and just literally curse a driver on the spot in front of the customer. Now, how do you think that makes that driver feel? At that point in time, it's really immaterial whether he was right or wrong. What is material is the fact that he got chastised, he got scolded in front of people. And there could have been many reasons for this process happening, but I merely want to point out that each department has to participate in addressing the culture and should be required to develop a retention goal. They don't have to be expensive, but they just have to look at the issue of how can we support a driver rather than, well, the driver's just here and that's the nature of the beast. How do we explore this change? In your assessment or in your outside source of assessment, you will identify areas that need or should be addressed. I want to say that this needs to be a very objective assessment, like in the previous slide. It's sometimes very difficult to take a hard look at your company and say that it may or may not have a wart or two on it. Then you have to look at possible solutions. In the case of this owner-operator, I think that the simple process of readdressing what we were telling an incoming person in the recruiting process, that addressed the problem. If they know what to expect and the expectation is met, then they can live with that. What they can't live with is an expectation that is false, And let me tell you something. If your recruiters are telling a driver one thing, and that is not exactly the way it is, the drivers will find out about it within 2 weeks. And there becomes that first little point of dissension. Be sure that you establish goals. Your company goals you establish every year, but include in that a retention goal. You as the owner, manager, or CEO are very familiar with establishing those goals. I want to grow the company in revenue by 10% this year. I think equally important to that is, as part of addressing that cost of hiring, that we retain 10% more of the drivers that we hire. And I don't think you can make this retention process a one-shot, instant going from 90% to 0% retention. I don't think that can be done. I think it needs to be a logical process that can be addressed and improved or tweaked in this whole process. Each department must submit, in my mind, and should have goals for this retention process. Then, I think every person in your company that has any interaction with a driver, and that's most everybody, or many, many folks, every participant has to be part of this retention process. And it is vital that the smile on the face, the addressing of a problem or a perceived problem truthfully and honestly, and sometimes you have to tell a driver, no, I cannot do that, and we all know that. But just be truthful. That is critical, and every participant in this process, every participant in this process should be aware of that and should practice that. This is the tough one. Acknowledging that your current policy has a problem. And this may be the actual crux of this whole matter. I would suggest and recommend that if you acknowledge that your current policy is not working, then in part of your assessment and part of your corrective action is to adopt a new policy, simple and direct, that has continuing executive support. And I want to stop again here for just a moment, and I will bring this subject up again. You are the captain of the ship. You are the owner. You are the CEO. You are the manager. Without your support, this process will revert back. If you've started this process and you've adopted a retention policy, without your support, you will revert to the status quo. And in addressing this support, I would say that you need to measure your progress. And let's go back to the 90% turnover rate. And let's say that was the turnover rate for your company. At the end of the year, and you set a goal of a 10% reduction. A 10% reduction simply means that instead of losing 9 out of 10, you're only going to lose 8 out of 10. And that progress needs to be measured, and it could be measured monthly, it could be measured annually, and should be measured annually. If you have 100 drivers that leave you every year, and that's a consistent figure, in other words, you are replacing 100 drivers every year, and your cost of hiring is $5,000, then what is the math on losing that 100 drivers and reducing it by 10%? How much money can you put to your bottom line by reducing the cost of hiring and improving your retention by simply just 10%? What are your responsibilities? As a CEO, as a manager, as an owner, you have several responsibilities, and I certainly don't need to name them. You know them all too well. You can either accept or the status quo, the nature of the beast, or you can say, you know, this is important. This provides our bottom line. This will provide greater satisfaction to our customers. And let me talk about that satisfaction process for just a minute. I would submit to you that a driver that has been on board with you for 5 years, and there's nothing magical about 5 years, is much better at satisfying your existing customers than a driver that you bring on board, or that the revolving door constantly means you have this new source of drivers. A driver that has been with you 5 years, it's proven, has less accident potential. They are involved in less accidents. So it is up to you. Do you want to make a decision to change, or are you satisfied with the status quo? It may be a little painful because there may be objection. There may be foot dragging. There may be, this is too much work. But I think it needs to be part of what is considered a long-term goal. What is best for my company? Where do I find better quality, and how do I improve the quality that I already have of my drivers? We always want to lower cost. I am constantly aware of lowering costs. I think that's critical because it contributes to my overall end profitability. And I would submit to you again that the reason we're in business, I believe, is to make a profit. I want to thank you for attending this Clinewood University webinar. I trust I have not bored you. I want to plant some seeds for you to explore. Is this important to you, or is it not? Can I make an assessment? How do I make improvements? So with that, I would turn this back over to John and say, John, do we have any input from our audience?
Well, thank you very much, Dave. And we have a large audience today who's asked many questions, and we've narrowed it down to a few that we think are broad and will encompass many of their inquiries. The first one that we have is, how and where do I begin this process?
The process is, as I've said many times during this webinar, the process starts with the executive committee, the owner, the CEO, or the manager. You have to say to yourself, is this something I want to explore? Can we go through this process? Can we be objective in what we're going to look at? Can I involve all of the departments? And what do we do if we're reluctant to address this issue? Or do we just stay with the status quo and continue to throw whatever amount of money, and you all can do the math on what your cost of hiring is and what your turnover is. That turnover is very easy. How many drivers did I hire last year to replace drivers that went away? There are sophisticated formulas to address that, but that's a very simple way to do it, to figure out how much money you're spending. We did not address where all those costs come from. The indirect costs are the big one. The truck sitting against the fence, and I would say that each and every one of you has had or does have now a tractor sitting idle that is not generating any revenue. And unless I do my math wrong, a non-revenue generating truck is taking away the potential for profitability. And I hope that answers the question, but the onus, the responsibility is on you as the CEO, the manager, or the owner. John.
Thanks. The next question we have is, how important is driver pay in this process?
This is a age-old argument, and we talked about it a little bit earlier. My finding is that almost in doing, I don't know the exact number of exit interviews I've done with drivers, and I think that's a critical part of this process. But in that exit interview, rarely do I hear home time. Rarely do I hear what kind of the upper echelon of what the issues that some of the more sophisticated associations note. What I do hear is, I wasn't dispatched fairly, I wasn't making any money, I sat at home, and you've heard all of these reasons. And I want to defend you as a trucking company executive. Yes, you may have a driver sit at home, but I found all too often if I ask that driver the next question, did you make yourself available for dispatch, then that kind of adds a whole new dimension to this pay issue. But if a driver tells me I've been available every minute, and the operations people say, yes, he's been available every minute, then I think that there is a problem with that pay issue. It may not be the direct amount that a driver is paid, or cents per mile, or dollars per hour, or percentage, but how that driver is dispatched, and is he making sufficient revenue to cover what you and your recruiters have told him. Thank you.
And we'll take one last question today. Can you tell us about some success stories of companies going through this process?
I can. When I was still with Cline Wood, we addressed this retention issue with about a 305 truck company that was had turnover of 130%, 132% to be precise. And in that process of addressing, making the assessment, because they hired us to come in and do that assessment, and to make recommendations to them. And it boiled down to one very simple thing. Really did. They had absolutely positively no training whatsoever. Their training period consisted of new drivers taking their physical, their drug test, and having the medical plan explained to them. And they were kind of sophisticated in the freight that they hauled. So my recommendation was that they centralize and all of their training was decentralized to various terminals. I made a recommendation that was a little bit hard to swallow for them, and I said, you need to centralize your training. That way the drivers are all hearing the same message from the same person. I would engage department heads or somebody from each department to come in and be part of that presentation process that affects their department. The training needs to go from probably about 6 hours. We created a training program that was 2.5 days, and almost immediately they took it to 4 days because the time was just not adequate. They went from 130% just on that factor alone. Now, let me rephrase that. The significant factor was this training factor, but they also addressed how drivers were treated by each terminal manager. And they went from 132% at the initiation to 82% the first year, and to, I'm going by memory here now, approximately 69% the second year. Unfortunately, they had some financial problems, and we did not continue that. I just recently did this process for a company in Colorado, and the first initial, they've just been in this process for slightly less than a year, but they're keeping track by month. They were at 101%, and they are now down at 94 for if you collectively average each month to this process. The process to me does work. The critical factor is this, that management makes a decision. This is something we're going to address. We have to address it. It affects us every day. We need to keep who we recruit. You cannot win the recruiting battle. You cannot win the retention battle. I'm sorry, you cannot win the recruiting battle until you retain what you recruit. Are there any other questions, John?
Unfortunately, we have more questions, but we're out of time. If anybody would like to submit their questions directly to Dave and the Clinewood team, please send an email to university@clinewood.com. You can also use that email or the 800 number on the screen to request a copy of today's PowerPoint if you're interested, or visit Clinewood's website to review a recording of the web seminar presentation. And with that, Dave, thank you once again for presenting. Thank you, Clinewood University, for bringing us this interesting content today, and thank you all for attending. With that, this web seminar is now ending. We hope you have a great day.